Thumb. 1965, the city poisoned into silence. What if the place you call home slowly turns against you without noise, without fire, without warning? In 1965, Creektown woke up to an ordinary morning that would quietly become the beginning of the end. No alarms sounded. No sirens wailed. Children still walked to school. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors, and factory whistles echoed through the valley as they always had. Yet something unseen had already entered the bloodstream of the city, and once it did, there would be no going back. Creektown was not a place people expected to vanish. It was stable working class, and unremarkable in the way that made it feel permanent. Families had lived there for generations. The river that cut through the town was its pride, supplying water, jobs, and identity. Locals trusted it the way you trust gravity or daylight. That trust would become their greatest vulnerability. The first warnings were subtle enough to dismiss. A metallic taste in the tap water, fish floating near the riverbanks with no visible wounds, garden plants wilting despite proper care, a few factory workers complaining of headaches that did not respond to rest. At first, these signs were treated as coincidences, the kind every town experiences and forgets. Creektown had endured floods, droughts, and economic downturns before. This felt smaller, manageable, temporary, but the symptoms did not fade. They multiplied. By Lachi Spring, local doctors began noticing patterns that unsettled them. Adults with no medical history arriving with nausea, skin irritation, sudden fatigue. Children experiencing nosebleeds, dizziness, unexplained rashes. Animals, especially pets, grew lethargic or aggressive, some dying within days. Still, no single cause tied it all together. Nothing obvious enough to panic a town that depended on routine. What made Creektown different from other towns was not just what was happening, but what could not be seen. There was no smoke plume, no foul odor, no visible spill. Whatever was poisoning the city did not announce itself. It moved silently through pipes, soil, and lungs, threading itself into daily life. People drank it, bathed in it, cooked with it. By the time suspicion replaced denial, exposure had already become constant. Behind closed doors, whispers started circulating. Factory waste, improper disposal, experimental chemicals. Some residents claimed the river looked different at dawn, darker, thicker, almost oily under certain light. Others swore trucks had been seen unloading barrels upstream at night, long before anyone got sick. These stories spread quickly but remained unconfirmed, and without proof, they stayed in the realm of rumor. Local authorities assured everyone there was no danger. Tests, they said, were being conducted. Results would come soon. Creektown was urged to remain calm. Business continued. Schools stayed open. Life moved forward, even as fear began to settle beneath every interaction. Parents watched their children more closely. Neighbors compared symptoms in hushed tones. Trust in official reassurances thinned with each passing week. The moment everything changed did not come from an announcement, but from absence. One morning, a family packed their belongings and left without explanation. Then another, and another. Houses sat dark at night, curtains drawn, mail piling up. Those who stayed noticed that people were not just leaving, they were escaping. No new plans to return. By the time state investigators quietly arrived, Creektown already felt unstable, like a body trying to survive while poisoned from within. Samples were taken. Notes were written. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar cars appeared. What was found would later be classified, disputed, or buried under technical language, but the damage was undeniable. Creektown had crossed an invisible line. This was the day the city understood that contamination does not need violence to destroy a place. It only needs time, silence, and the false comfort of not knowing. And once that realization took hold, the collapse of Creektown became inevitable, unfolding slowly, relentlessly, and far from public view. If this story is already making you question what really happened in Creektown, take a moment to slow down and think about what you have just heard. Stories like this are not only about abandoned places. They are about decisions, silence, and consequences that many people never get. Answers for understanding the details matters, because once you see how easily an entire town can be erased without headlines or warnings, you start noticing patterns that repeat in other places and other times. If you want to continue uncovering what was hidden, leave a comment below and share what you think might have caused the contamination in Creektown. Your perspective helps deepen this investigation. If this story is holding your attention so far, make sure to leave a like and check that you are subscribed, because the next part takes us deeper into the first ignored symptoms and the moment the town realized the damage could no longer be denied. At first, Creektown did what most communities do when reality becomes uncomfortable. It explained everything away. The sickness was seasonal. The water tasted strange because of aging pipes. The dead fish were blamed on temperature changes in the river. Each explanation felt reasonable on its own, and together they formed a shield against panic. No one wanted to believe their town was being poisoned. The earliest victims were easy to overlook. A factory worker missing a few shifts because of exhaustion. A school teacher complaining of migraines that would not go away. A child fainting during recess on a warm afternoon. These incidents were logged quietly, treated individually, never connected. Creektown trusted patterns only when they were obvious, and this pattern was deliberately subtle. Doctors began to notice it before anyone else. Patients with no shared lifestyle, no family connection, and no prior conditions were showing up with eerily similar symptoms: persistent nausea, burning sensations on the skin without visible cause, tremors in the hands, memory lapses that appeared suddenly and worsened over days. Blood tests returned inconclusive or contradictory results. Nothing matched known illnesses cleanly. One local physician reportedly contacted a regional hospital after seeing 3 unrelated cases of acute neurological distress in the same week. The response was cautious. Environmental exposure was suggested, but without proof, the idea went no further. No alerts were issued. No warnings were sent to the public. Creektown remained officially healthy. Meanwhile, residents began changing their behavior instinctively. People stopped drinking tap water straight from the sink, even if they could not explain why. Some started buying bottled water despite reassurances that it was unnecessary. Others noticed their pets refusing to drink from their bowls, choosing puddles or rainwater instead. These small shifts went unspoken, but they spread quickly. By early summer, the illnesses were no longer isolated. Entire households began experiencing symptoms within days of each other. Parents watched their children lose weight, struggle to concentrate, and complain of pain they could not describe. Elderly residents declined rapidly, their conditions progressing faster than expected. The local cemetery filled at a pace that unsettled even those accustomed to loss. What frightened people most was the randomness. There was no single neighborhood affected first, no clear boundary of safety. Homes near the river suffered, but so did houses miles away. Workers from different industries, students from different schools, families with no social connection, all began sharing the same quiet fear. Whatever was happening did not discriminate. Rumors intensified as facts remained scarce. Some residents believed the contamination came from upstream industrial dumping. Others whispered about military testing, citing increased activity near restricted areas months earlier. A few insisted it was radiation, even though no official source confirmed it. Every theory was fueled by the same absence of clarity. Town meetings became tense. Officials repeated that investigations were ongoing. They urged patience. They emphasized calm. But calm was difficult when ambulances became irregular. Sound in classrooms had empty desks that were never refilled. Creektown was no longer asking if something was wrong. It was asking how long it had been wrong. The most unsettling realization arrived slowly. People began to understand that if the contamination had already reached this many residents, it meant exposure had started long before anyone noticed. The sickness was not new. Only awareness was. And by the time awareness arrived, the damage was already embedded in bodies, homes, and habits. Creektown was still standing, still functioning on the surface. But beneath that routine, fear was replacing trust. Neighbors watched each other for signs of illness. Parents debated leaving without knowing where to go. Doctors kept records they did not share publicly. The town was holding its breath, waiting for answers that refused to come. By the time official testing began in Creektown, the damage was already layered deep into everyday life. What troubled residents most was not just that tests were happening, but how quietly they were conducted. Unmarked vehicles arrived before dawn. Men in plain clothing collected water samples from the river, the reservoirs, even private wells, often without explanation. Soil was taken from gardens, schoolyards, and the edges of factory grounds. Air monitors appeared briefly on rooftops, then vanished days later. No results were posted, no timelines were given. Authorities insisted these were routine environmental checks, yet their behaviors suggested urgency mixed with caution. Locals noticed that some tests were repeated multiple times in the same locations, as if initial findings were too disturbing to accept. A few technicians reportedly wore protective gloves and masks, even while assuring residents there was no immediate danger. That contradiction did not go unnoticed. Whispers began circulating about what the samples might reveal. Some claimed the water showed abnormal chemical signatures inconsistent with industrial waste typically regulated at the time. Others said trace elements were found that did not officially exist in civilian use in 1965. Theories spread fast, but confirmation never followed. Instead, information stalled behind technical language and bureaucratic silence. One leaked conversation, later referenced by a former municipal employee, suggested elevated toxicity levels far beyond what public safety standards would allow. Another source claimed the contamination was not singular, but a compound mixture, something that made identification deliberately difficult. If true, it meant Creektown was not facing a simple spill or accident, but a layered exposure that defied easy explanation. Requests for transparency were met with reassurances instead of data. Residents were told the findings were inconclusive, still under review, or not yet verified. Meanwhile, restrictions quietly increased. Fishing was discouraged without formal bans. Certain water sources were labeled temporarily unsafe. Livestock owners were advised to relocate animals as a precaution. None of these measures were announced loudly enough to cause panic. But together, they painted a clear picture for those paying attention. Doctors noticed another disturbing shift. Some patients showed improvement after leaving town, even briefly. Symptoms lessened after days away, only to return sharply upon coming back. That pattern suggested ongoing exposure rather than a one-time event. It also raised a terrifying possibility. Creektown itself had become the source of illness. Behind closed doors, officials debated next steps. Evacuation was discussed but never ordered publicly. The reason, according to later accounts, was uncertainty mixed with liability. Declaring contamination would mean accountability. It would mean acknowledging failure, negligence, or something far worse. And so the town was left in limbo, sick enough to abandon, but not officially sick enough to save, as weeks turned into months. Testing slowed rather than intensified. Some equipment disappeared altogether. Residents who requested copies of reports were denied access or told the documents did not exist. The investigation, once active, became fragmented and opaque. Creektown was no longer being studied to be cured. It was being studied to be managed. This was the moment many residents realized the truth might never be fully revealed. The contamination was real. The effects were measurable. But the story behind it was being deliberately blurred. And when truth becomes inconvenient, abandonment often follows faster than accountability. What do you believe the authorities were trying to avoid revealing? By late 1965, the most dangerous force in Creektown was no longer the contamination itself, but the silence surrounding it. Official statements grew shorter, less frequent, and carefully worded to say as little as possible. Meetings that once welcomed public questions were suddenly postponed or held behind closed doors. When residents asked directly whether it was safe to stay, the answers avoided commitment. Phrases like no immediate risk and situation under evaluation became shields against responsibility. What many people did not realize at the time was that decisions were already being made, just not in public. Internal correspondence, referenced years later by former regional officials, suggested that Creektown had been quietly categorized as a controlled loss, not worth the cost of remediation, not politically useful enough to justify exposure, too small to matter beyond its borders. Instead of evacuation orders, authorities chose attrition. Services were reduced subtly. Medical staff were reassigned. Supply deliveries slowed. Maintenance on infrastructure was delayed indefinitely. The message was never spoken aloud, but it was clear to those living there. You are on your own now. Residents who demanded answers found themselves isolated. Some reported visits from officials who warned them against spreading panic. Others were told their claims could interfere with ongoing investigations. A few outspoken locals suddenly faced inspections, fines, or unexplained legal pressure. Fear shifted from illness to retaliation. The schools became one of the first visible casualties. Attendance dropped as parents kept children home, yet no closures were announced. Teachers struggled to maintain normalcy in half-empty classrooms. Eventually, staff shortages made it impossible to continue. The school doors closed quietly, without ceremony, leaving families with one less reason to stay. Utilities followed a similar pattern. Water quality notices were issued without clear guidance. Power outages became more frequent and slower to fix. Public transportation routes were altered or canceled altogether. Creektown was being disconnected piece by piece, not through disaster, but through neglect. The most devastating choice was the refusal to acknowledge long-term danger. Without an official declaration, residents were not eligible for relocation assistance. There were no compensation programs, no emergency housing. Leaving meant abandoning homes, jobs, and histories with no guarantee of support elsewhere. Staying meant risking health in a place that was clearly no longer safe. Families began leaving at night to avoid attention. Trucks were packed quickly. Furniture was left behind. Some homes were locked forever. Others simply abandoned mid-life. Dishes still in sinks, calendars still hanging on walls marked with dates that would never arrive. Creektown did not die in a single moment. It was slowly starved of protection, truth, and accountability. The silence of those in power became a verdict. Not guilty. Not responsible. Just gone. Once the silence became permanent, Creektown began to fracture from the inside. Not all families could leave at the same time, and not all of them agreed on whether leaving was even the right choice. Some believed the danger was exaggerated, a temporary scare inflated by rumor and fear. Others were convinced that staying meant irreversible harm. This disagreement split households, neighbors, even lifelong friendships. Older residents were often the most resistant. Creektown was everything they knew. Their parents were buried there. Their memories were embedded in the streets, the riverbanks, the churches that still stood but no longer rang with voices. To leave felt like surrender, not just to illness, but to erasure. Many refused to believe the town itself could become hostile. They had survived wars, recessions, and disasters elsewhere. This, they said, would pass. Younger families felt time closing in. They watched children grow thinner, quieter, more withdrawn. They tracked symptoms in notebooks, compared notes with other parents, and noticed the same disturbing patterns. Improvement when visiting relatives elsewhere. Relapse within days of returning. For them, the decision was no longer emotional. It was biological. Staying meant gambling with bodies that were still developing. Arguments became routine. Spouses disagreed on risks. Parents clashed with adult children who wanted to leave immediately. Some families made impossible compromises. Children were sent away to live with relatives while parents stayed behind to sell property that no one wanted to buy. In many causes, that sale never happened. As departure accelerated, it did not happen openly. There were no farewell gatherings, no announcements. Leaving Creektown began to feel shameful, as if abandoning it meant admitting something terrible that no one wanted to name. Trucks were loaded after dark. Cars left before dawn. People avoided eye contact during their final days, afraid of being asked questions they could not answer. Entire blocks emptied within weeks. Lights went out and never came back on. Lawns grew wild. Windows cracked and stayed unrepaired. The town's sounds changed. Fewer footsteps, fewer engines. The constant background noise of life faded into something hollow and unnatural. Those who remained noticed it immediately. Silence carries weight when it replaces routine. Businesses followed the people. The grocery store reduced hours, then closed entirely. The diner that once served shift workers shut its doors with a handwritten sign promising to reopen soon. It never did. The gas station ran out of fuel deliveries and boarded its windows. Creektown lost not just population, but function. The emotional toll was brutal. Residents who stayed felt abandoned by those who left. Those who left felt guilt for surviving. Many carried the sense that they'd escaped something unnamed but real, something that could follow them if they spoke too openly about it. Some refused to tell new neighbors where they came from. Others changed their stories entirely. The most haunting scenes came from homes left behind. Beds still made, photographs still framed, toys abandoned mid-play. It was as if life had paused suddenly, waiting for people who would never return. Creektown was not evacuated. It was deserted in fragments, family by family, night by night. By the time the exodus slowed, the town no longer felt alive enough to save. It had crossed another invisible threshold, a place with buildings, but without continuity. A city that still existed on maps, but no longer in the rhythms that make a place real. When Creektown was nearly empty, the investigation finally became more honest, though still far from public. With most residents gone, there was little left to protect politically. No crowds to calm. No children to reassure. What remained was a contaminated landscape and a paper trail that revealed far more than anyone had admitted while people still lived there. Later assessments, pieced together from fragmented reports and testimony, pointed to a convergence of toxins rather than a single source. Soil samples taken near the riverbank showed abnormal concentrations of heavy metals that should never have appeared together naturally. Elements commonly associated with industrial solvents were detected alongside compounds typically restricted to controlled environments. The mixture itself was unusual, suggesting deliberate handling rather than accidental leakage. Water testing told an even darker story. Underground aquifers beneath Creektown were compromised, meaning contamination had seeped deep below the surface, making filtration or surface cleanup nearly impossible. The river, once the town's lifeline, carried traces of chemical byproducts that altered its biological balance. Fish tissue samples revealed bioaccumulation, toxins building up over time rather than dispersing. This explained why illness appeared slowly, then escalated without warning. Air quality reports were perhaps the most disturbing. While there was no visible pollution, particulate matter carried microscopic residues capable of being inhaled and absorbed through the lungs. These particles fluctuated depending on weather patterns, rising during certain temperature shifts and settling during others. It meant exposure was not constant, but unpredictable, which made diagnosis and prevention nearly impossible. What connected these findings was time. Experts later concluded that the contamination did not originate from a single catastrophic event, but from prolonged exposure. Small releases, repeated dumping, gradual seepage, each incident minor enough to escape detection, but together forming a lethal environment. Creektown had been poisoned slowly, patiently, over years. Why this happened remains disputed. Some evidence pointed toward improper waste disposal tied to regional industrial expansion during the early 1960s. Other documents hinted at experimental materials moved through the area under vague classifications. Nothing definitive was ever confirmed publicly, and key records were sealed or destroyed before independent review could occur. What mattered more than the cause was the conclusion reached privately. Creektown could not be safely restored with the technology of the time. The contamination was embedded too deeply, spread too broadly, and too costly to remove. Any attempt to clean it would risk stirring toxins back into the air and water. The safest option, according to internal recommendations, was isolation. And so Creektown became something else entirely. Not just abandoned, but classified as unsafe for habitation. A place better left untouched than disturbed. The town was not erased because it lacked value. It was erased because fixing it would have exposed too much. After Creektown was emptied, the story did not end. It fractured. What should have become a clear historical record instead dissolved into competing theories, redacted files, and testimonies that surfaced only decades later, often from people who had nothing left to lose. With no residents remaining to demand answers, the narrative was quietly reshaped, simplified, and in many cases erased. One of the most persistent theories centered on missing documentation. Municipal records from the early 1960s abruptly stopped referencing certain infrastructure projects near the river. Environmental permits that should have existed for industrial transport simply vanished from archives. Former clerks later claimed entire filing cabinets were removed from local offices during what was described as a routine audit. No inventory of what was taken was ever released. Former workers provided another layer of unease. Years later, a handful of men who had been employed in logistics and waste transport came forward anonymously. They described nighttime operations, sealed containers, and instructions not to log specific deliveries. According to their accounts, the materials were not labeled as hazardous, but the handling protocols suggested otherwise. Gloves were required, containers were never opened on site. Any spills, no matter how small, were reported immediately and handled by outside teams. Then there were the medical testimonies that never entered official reports. Several doctors who treated Creektown residents claimed their findings were discouraged from publication. One physician alleged that a preliminary paper linking neurological symptoms to long-term low-dose exposure was rejected repeatedly without explanation. Another stated that she was advised to redirect her research focus if she wished to continue receiving institutional funding. Perhaps the most unsettling accounts came from former investigators. One environmental analyst later stated that his team identified compounds that did not match any civilian registry available at the time. When he requested clarification, he was told the substances fell under restricted classifications and were beyond his clearance. Shortly after, the investigation was reassigned, and he was transferred to an unrelated project in another state. Conspiracy theories flourished in the absence of clarity. Some believed Creektown had been used as an unknowing test site, chosen for its size, isolation, and lack of political influence. Others argued it was simply a dumping ground, sacrificed for economic convenience during a period of rapid industrial growth. A smaller group insisted the truth was far less dramatic, but far more damning, that negligence was allowed to continue because fixing it would have cost more than abandoning the town. What tied all these theories together was not proof, but consistency. Different people from different roles, at different times, describing patterns that align too closely to dismiss outright. Silence enforced not by a single authority, but by overlapping interests, legal barriers, and fear of consequence. Even today, requests for full declassification are denied or delayed. Files remain sealed under environmental, industrial, or national security exemptions. Without documents, Creektown exists in a gray zone between fact and speculation. Officially acknowledged as abandoned due to contamination, unofficially remembered as something far more troubling. The town became a lesson in how history can be buried without being resolved, not through destruction of evidence alone, but through fragmentation. When no single story survives intact, the truth becomes easier to dismiss. For those who escaped Creektown, leaving did not mean freedom. It meant carrying the town with them quietly and permanently. Long after the physical symptoms eased for some, the psychological damage continued to surface in ways that were harder to diagnose and far more difficult to explain to anyone who had not lived through it. Many former residents described a persistent sense of unease that followed them wherever they went. Ordinary sounds triggered memories. The rush of running water caused anxiety. The smell of metal or chemicals, even when faint, sparked panic. Some developed compulsive behaviors, refusing to drink tap water, washing their hands excessively, or avoiding basements and enclosed spaces. What had once been routine became a source of threat. Survivors also carried guilt. Parents who left early wondered if they had overreacted. Parents who stayed longer questioned whether they had waited too long. Those who sent children away while remaining behind felt torn in two, haunted by the idea that separation itself caused harm. There was no version of leaving Creektown that felt clean or correct. Every choice came with consequences. In new towns, former residents learned quickly not to talk about where they came from. When they did, reactions were uncomfortable. Some listeners dismissed the story as exaggeration. Others treated it like an urban legend, something entertaining but not real. A few reacted with suspicion, subtly distancing themselves as if contamination could be social as well as physical. Over time, silence felt safer. Mental health professionals later noted patterns consistent with prolonged environmental trauma, chronic anxiety, depression tied to displacement, difficulty forming attachments to new places. Creektown had not only poisoned bodies, it had broken the fundamental assumption that home is a place of safety. Once that belief is shattered, rebuilding it elsewhere is painfully slow. Some survivors returned years later, drawn by unresolved questions. They drove through cracked streets, overtaken by weeds, past homes collapsing under their own weight. Standing there, many reported an overwhelming sense of disorientation. This place had shaped them, yet it no longer recognized them. The town felt frozen in time, While their lives had been forced forward without closure, others refused to return at all. They believed the land itself carried memory, that stepping back into Creektown risked reopening wounds that had never fully healed. For them, the town existed only in dreams, often recurring ones, where streets looked normal, people were alive, and the danger remained invisible but imminent. What made the trauma deeper was the absence of acknowledgement. No official apology, no memorial, no recognition that what happened mattered. Without validation, survivors were left to process loss privately, often questioning their own memories. When history does not confirm your experience, self-doubt becomes another burden to carry. Creektown did not just disappear from maps, it dissolved from shared memory, leaving those who lived there stranded between past and present. They became witnesses to something no one wanted to fully accept, and in that isolation, the psychological damage endured far longer than the contamination itself. Today, Creektown exists in a strange state between presence and absence. It has not been erased, redeveloped, or officially sealed off with dramatic warnings. Instead, it remains where it always was, quietly decaying, as if time itself decided to slow down out of respect or fear. Roads still lead there. Street signs still stand, but almost everything else feels suspended, unfinished. From a distance, the town looks deceptively intact. Rows of houses lean under the weight of years but remain upright. Storefronts still bear faded lettering, their windows clouded with dust and grime. Nature has begun reclaiming sidewalks, pushing through cracks that widen a little more each season. Trees grow where playgrounds once stood. Vines crawl across school walls, threading through broken windows like veins. Access to certain areas is unofficially discouraged. There are no consistent barriers, but signs appear and disappear warning of environmental hazards. Unstable structures or restricted land. Locals from neighboring towns say enforcement is inconsistent, almost intentional. Enough warning to avoid liability, not enough to draw attention. Those who wander too far report being questioned, sometimes escorted out, rarely given clear explanations. Environmental readings taken by independent researchers years later suggest that while acute toxicity has decreased, the land has not fully recovered. Soil samples still show irregular chemical signatures. Water sources fluctuate unpredictably, testing within safe limits one month and exceeding them the next. Air measurements remain inconclusive, changing with weather patterns, pressure shifts, and seasonal cycles. Creektown does not behave like a neutral environment. It behaves like something unsettled. What unsettles visitors most is not data, but atmosphere. People describe an oppressive stillness, heavier than ordinary abandonment. Sounds travel oddly. Footsteps echo longer than expected. Wind moves through structures in low, uneven tones. Some report headaches or nausea after short visits, while others feel nothing physically but leave with an intense urge to get away quickly without understanding why. Former residents who return briefly often say the same thing. The town feels wrong. Not dangerous in an obvious way, but misaligned. As if the land remembers what happened and resists being whether this is psychological projection or something environmental is still debated, but the consistency of these accounts is difficult to ignore. Creektown has become a destination for urban explorers and researchers drawn by mystery rather than nostalgia. Many arrive expecting dramatic ruins. Most leave unsettled instead. They document abandoned homes. Frozen in midlife, calendars still open to 1965. Notes scribbled on kitchen counters, children's drawings faded but intact. These artifacts do not feel old. They feel interrupted. Despite decades passing, no large-scale cleanup or redevelopment has ever taken place. Proposals surface occasionally, then disappear. The cost remains high. The liability higher. Creektown sits in a legal and environmental limbo, neither condemned nor restored. Its continued existence raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility and memory. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is this. Creektown did not collapse violently. It did not burn, flood, or explode. It simply became uninhabitable, slowly enough to avoid attention, quietly enough to be forgotten. And in doing so, it stands as a reminder that some places do not end. They wait. Even decades later, Creektown refuses to become just another footnote in history. Its legacy is not defined only by contamination or abandonment, but by what its disappearance reveals about how societies choose convenience over confrontation. What happened there exposed a fragile truth. Entire communities can be erased not by catastrophe, but by decision. Creektown forces an uncomfortable comparison with other places that vanished quietly. Mining towns abandoned after toxic runoff. Neighborhoods sacrificed for industrial expansion. Rural communities written off as acceptable losses. In each case, the pattern is familiar. Early warning signs appear. Authorities delay. Responsibility fragments. By the time the truth is undeniable, the population is already gone, and accountability becomes optional. The most lasting damage was not physical, it was institutional. Creektown demonstrated how easily systems designed to protect people can be redirected to protect themselves instead. Environmental thresholds were debated instead of enforced. Health concerns were reframed as statistical anomalies. Human suffering was reduced to manageable variables. Once that shift occurred, abandonment became a rational outcome rather than a moral failure. What makes Creektown particularly haunting is the absence of closure. There was no public reckoning, no clear explanation accepted by all sides, no official acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Without these, the story never settled. It lingered past quietly between former residents, researchers, and locals who sensed something was wrong but never learned exactly what. This lack of resolution continues to shape how the town is remembered. For some, Creektown is proof of negligence. For others, evidence of concealment. For a few, it is a warning about what happens when technological ambition outpaces ethical responsibility. Each interpretation exists because no definitive narrative replaced speculation. You can still trace the consequences outward. Families displaced without compensation. Medical histories marked by unexplained illness. Records that end abruptly, leaving gaps that invite suspicion. Creektown did not just vanish geographically. It fractured timelines, interrupted lives, and left behind unanswered questions that ripple far beyond its borders. Perhaps the most unsettling legacy is how familiar the story feels. Creektown does not belong only to 1965. Its outline appears repeatedly in modern debates about environmental safety, industrial secrecy, and public trust. The town stands as a reminder that contamination is not always accidental, and abandonment is rarely sudden. As long as documents remain sealed and responsibility remains diffuse, Creektown will continue to exist in a gray space between tragedy and warning. Not fully past, not fully addressed. A place that challenges the idea that progress always leaves improvement behind. The city may be empty, but its questions are not. Who decided it was acceptable to let it die? What information was withheld, and from whom? And how many other places followed the same path without ever being noticed? If you had the power to reopen the case of Creektown today, what would you want uncovered first? Leave a comment sharing the question you believe still matters most. If you stayed with this story until the end, it means Creektown left an impression on you, and that matters. Stories like this only stay alive when people question them, discuss them, and refuse to let them fade into silence. If this investigation made you think differently about abandoned cities, contamination, or how easily entire communities can disappear, now is the moment to engage. Leave a comment below and write Creektown if you reached the end, and share the one question you believe authorities never wanted answered. Your comment helps keep this discussion alive and brings these forgotten stories back into the light. If you found value in this deep investigation, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support long-form, research-driven stories like this and ensure more mysteries like Creektown continue to be explored. And don't stop here. The next video appearing on your screen dives into another abandoned place with secrets that were never meant to surface. Click it now and continue the investigation.